Hey everyone, we're back. I'm Lauren Ward. I'm one of the producers for the fire season of NASA Explorers. As you know, you've been watching the series, and it's been a long fire season, and Doug has actually been with us almost every step of the way. He's been our main expert, really guiding us through what's going on, and I thought that near here at the end of the year that we could talk with Doug again and sort of recap what's happened. There's been some extreme fires all over the world. In some surprising places for people like us who aren't scientists. Again, thank you, Dr. Doug Morton. It's great to have you back.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it.
Awesome. So one of the things that was really surprising for myself, and I think a lot of other people, was that there was a lot of news this year about fires in the Arctic. And that was surprising because I think when we think of the Arctic, we think, oh, it's covered in ice, it's snow. Can you describe why that happened and how that might be related to climate change?
So, Lauren, the high latitudes, so we're thinking now about places like Alaska, Canada, Siberia, and then even further north into the tundra, are warming much more rapidly than the rest of the planet. Mm-hmm. So as we look to the way that climate change will create conditions that are hotter and drier, that's where we look first. So this was a year where Anchorage saw record temperatures.
Right.
At times this summer, Anchorage was warmer than here in Washington, D.C. We saw a series of events play out where warmer and drier conditions started earlier in the season, which just leads to the potential for a longer fire season. So a lot of the same ingredients are happening in those latitudes. It's just like we've turned up the heat.
Mm-hmm. Literally.
Quite literally.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we forget too, even though our poles are very cold, sure, they are changing the fastest.
So as we look through the observational record and as we project into the future, using our most advanced models of the Earth system and the climate, we anticipate that those landscapes are going to continue to warm much more rapidly than the rest of the planet. It's a little bit beyond the scope of just fire, but it's a series of feedbacks between the land,
right,
the ocean surface, and the amount of ice that remains there that controls how rapidly those places warm. What that also means is, of course, that the poles are starting to change the way that we are experiencing climate change in the mid-latitudes, where many more people live. So as the polar jet stream shifts, we're seeing more strong variability in patterns of weather and ultimately climate across places like the heat waves we've seen in Europe, the
right,
heat waves and the cold snaps we've seen across other parts of both the US and elsewhere in the world. So the Earth is one interconnected system, and it's changing.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Southern Hemisphere. You go to the Amazon many, many times a year. That is your place that you understand the best. We had a lot of fires there as well, but they weren't caused by lightning strikes. They were caused by people. Can you talk about the fire season in the Amazon, how that relates to the past fire seasons, and maybe how that, even though it was caused by people, is also exacerbated by climate change?
So the Amazon region is a place where fire is used regularly to clear rainforest and convert it into cropland or pasture for raising cattle. It's typical not just in the Amazon, but across other tropical forest regions that it's very difficult to get the wood out of the way and use it for something else. And so fire is the cheapest and most effective way to get rid of the wood when it's really not something you can sell. I can't sell you wood if you have wood and I have wood.
Has no value.
Has no value. Sadly, that tall tropical forest timber essentially is worthless on the frontier landscape where everybody has wood, but nobody has other things they would like to have. This year was a remarkable year in terms of fire activity in the Amazon because of the way in which it was coordinated, the way in which it was started earlier in the fire season. There was economic motivation this year that led to some synchronized fire activity in the central Amazon region, state of Pará in Brazil. And that kicked off a peak of fire activity in August that led to widespread problems with air quality, where people in the western Amazon were getting the smoke blown downwind. And because the fire started earlier in 2019, the pattern of winds actually took that smoke and sent it south over Bolivia, down to southern Brazil, cities like São Paulo, where for 20 million people in the metro area of São Paulo, day literally turned into night as this enormous cloud of smoke was blown out of the Amazon region and fumigated the largest city in Brazil. What we saw then was really a reaction to the fact that that long-distance transport of smoke started some finger pointing inside of Brazil and catalyzed international attention about the issue of fires in the Amazon and what that meant in terms of protecting and preserving remaining Amazon forests. So the sequence of events that started with a coordinated group of ranchers in the central Amazon ultimately led to a conversation at the G7 about what the global community could do to curtail the fires burning in the Amazon. The decisions that were made after that point were more political than scientific, but I think this might be one of the fastest feedback loops between a phenomenon in the Earth system, in this case some dedicated fire activity in the Amazon region, and the global response and then change in course of action. That'll happen in a matter of weeks.
Yeah, it was fast.
So I think this highlights one other aspect of the new normal, and that is that the global community and our interconnectedness allows us to be a part of a conversation about decision-making that's happening thousands, if not tens of thousands of kilometers away. Interestingly, satellite data are at the heart of that conversation. We need to be starting from the same facts. We need to be discussing and talking about the way in which we're using our day-to-day coverage from NASA satellites and others to make sure that we're making informed science-based decisions. So I take heart in the fact that fire detections and the characterization really is the basic fundamental facts that we're working from. What we do about it, of course, is a decision-making that goes beyond the scope of science, but the fact that it's rooted in those science data, I think, is encouraging, because those science data are made freely available to everyone worldwide. So really, we're all starting with the same facts.
What you're saying is that we are now so connected that something like that can go through public discourse like that, and policy can be enacted quickly, which is something that we need in an era of quickly changing environments. So that gives you hope.
It does give me hope. I think it's, again, it's part of the way in which the new sources of information and the connectedness we have should facilitate more rapid changes. I was asked many questions this dry season in the Amazon about whether this was a record year or anything other remarkable about the fires that were burning this year. And of course, there are many science stories as well as many explanations that I could give for that answer. But one thing that I kept coming back to was we have information that we get twice a day from space that tells us about the extent and the magnitude of burning. We don't really have to wait for a record before we start taking change in direction, change of course. And so I felt that was a good time to remind people that we don't need to wait until we've broken the long-term satellite record for active fire detections in the Amazon to decide whether we should do something about it.
Right. Do you think that point was heard? Do you think people kind of heard that and said, you know, you're right, we should do something now?
So in landscapes like the Amazon frontier, where fire is really used as a part of the economic process, the answer to that question depends on whether you were favoring some additional expansion of agricultural landscapes or dead set against it. And so whether all fires are bad is an open question, and I think does depend on the circumstances. The way I look at it is that we're trying to have a science-based discussion about the sustainable trajectory for the Amazon region. Agriculture is a part of that landscape. Intact forests are part of that landscape. And fire represents both an opportunity and a risk. And so making sure that we're cognizant, careful, and planning for what we think that sustainable future looks like is where the satellite information we get every day comes into play.
And I think you touch on something really important, which is fire is really complicated. And in many landscapes, it is very destructive, but it's also, you can be used in a productive way.
So we know we're living in a planet that's warmer and drier and therefore more fire prone. And we're seeing that play out from Alaska to Australia in terms of how fires this year have burned in more extreme ways, whether that's burning faster, burning longer, burning hotter, and having more intense and more long-lasting impact on those ecosystems. Every year from space, we map 1 million large wildfires.
That's incredible.
1 million large fires.
1 million. And what's a large fire?
So for us, a large fire would be something on the order of 100 acres.
Okay.
And so if we're mapping more than 1 million fires that are larger than 100 acres, that means that fires are really burning across every biome and in every landscape. Now, the most important fire to you is the one that's burning in your community. And so Imagine there then are 1 million different communities that are facing those conditions where fire represents a potential threat to their home, to their property, to their communities. The collected effort in terms of our understanding, and then trying to hold the line against fires that are damaging, destructive, or as I would talk about in terms of burning Amazon rainforest, kind of a lose-lose. It's a loss of economic value, it's a loss of ecological value, and nobody wants those to happen. And yet they're getting more difficult to prevent and more difficult to put out. The reality is that fires are continuing to burn and change our landscapes, even in places that have been fire prone. Places like California, for example, we're still seeing new extreme fire behavior. The last 5 years have seen almost every year an increase in the record size of fires. Every year we've set a new record for the largest fire ever recorded in California. That's one example of the changing extreme nature of fires.
And yet, I think what's really interesting is that one statistic about, we've mapped 1 million fires.
Every year.
Every year. What was the percent that was just dedicated to North America in terms of that 1 million?
So while we are often focused here in the United States on the fires that burn across the western states, places like California, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, all of the burning in the lower 48 only accounts for 1% of the greenhouse gases that fires release worldwide every year. So changing dynamics are influencing our communities and our ecosystems and our policies here in the United States, but the lower 48 is only 1% of the global picture of fire activity. And I think that's really why the global perspective that we bring here at NASA and the way in which we're able to use satellite data to not only focus in on fires where we may have a much more direct line connecting those active fire detections to the firefighters on the ground. It's critical that we keep a global picture because the entire planet is responding to warming and drying conditions, and we're seeing those changes in fire activity, whether it's climate-driven or human-driven, play out across the world.
How do scientists like yourself tease apart the interannual variability of fires? How do you basically know that there is a trend and it's not something that's completely normal, it's our planet doing what it does, but that there's actually some new influence affecting what normal is for the fire season?
Part of our job as scientists is try to understand the degree to which climate change in particular is one of the important ingredients in landscapes that are seeing more fire activity. The other part of that is actually a positive story, in that the more we understand about our planet and its changes, the better prepared we are to predict landscapes that will become fire prone. And I think that's another part of our new normal. We have landscapes that we understand pretty well. Places like Indonesia that respond almost immediately to the onset of an El Nino event, where the maritime continent is always raining. El Nino brings 2 to 3 months of drought, which allow landscapes that are covered by peatlands in the tropics, tropical forests and grasslands, to begin burning. And the only thing that will put them back out again is when the rains return. So those are landscapes where as soon as we know an El Nino is coming, and today we can predict those 6 to 9 months ahead of time, we know those landscapes are likely to become at greater risk of fire activity. And I do think that that helps managers and decision makers in those locations to take actions to help try to mitigate what could be a severe fire year. Indonesia is one example.
Right.
The Amazon and other tropical areas also respond to the El Nino cycle. Outside of the tropics, our efforts to predict where those landscapes are and how we can anticipate the changing climate conditions is one of the challenges that we face as scientists.
Yeah.
How can we communicate our understanding of the changes and at the timescales that are needed by decision makers to actually proactively manage circumstances that are leading to greater fire risk? Lauren, one of the things that's happened this year is that we've seen a new conversation start around our new normal. This is the first year that we have proactively made decisions to try to reduce large-scale risks of fire activity, in part based on our forecast of changing conditions.
I think what a lot of people are wondering is, how can I protect my own communities, my own home, my own safety, but then how can I make sure that I am not contributing to factors that are creating conditions for more intense fires? Essentially, what can people do to be prepared or even be proactive?
We should have another episode on that, because there's a lot to unpack there. And I do think that the experiences that we are observing, whether it's in your actual community or you're the one watching through TV or social media about how communities are responding to extreme fire events, I think that's given a number of people pause for thought. I do think there are some activities that communities will take on their own to make their communities less fire prone. Some things are rather simple. There are zoning laws that are trying to remove the connectivity. The things we think about that drive a big fire are the fact that the fuels can connect, and so they can burn across an entire landscape. So actions that help reduce the continuity of fuels, removing brush and trees from around your home, for example, those are simple steps that make a big difference under many circumstances. The preparedness angle is something that I think those living in fire-prone landscapes are starting to appreciate in a different way. I think that's a challenging new reality for many people that have known something different in their communities up until now, and now are realizing that the landscapes that they know and love are more of a threat than they'd previously realized. And so I think there's a lot that's going to take place in the next years as communities start to reckon with that new reality. Collectively, reducing greenhouse gases from fossil fuels is the solution. Mm-hmm. So
for many problems, it sounds like.
For climate change.
Right.
For climate change, we need to reduce the amount of fossil fuel we use for electricity, for transportation, and all other uses. Yeah. That's the answer. So I think that's something that every one of us can take to heart. That's something that actually is our understanding of the climate change problem and how we solve it. And so I think that's a collected action, not just for individuals or communities, but for states and countries to make serious progress on.
And what you're saying actually hits close to home for me as well, because I asked that question almost on a selfish basis, because as we were making this series, I'm also from California, and I'm watching the fire season get dangerously close to where my family, where my friends live. And actually, a couple weeks ago, staying back in California to help prepare for a possible evacuation, which was why I was gone for a couple weeks, is something that a lot of people in my community are really thinking about. And it has become a new normal. It gets very close every year. And I think a lot of people, as you say, are doing their best to prepare. They're reacting, wearing masks are very common now if the air quality gets too bad, but it's doing things like having an emergency plan, making sure that your community is doing something to keep your area safe if you do live on that kind of urban wildlife interface. So it is something that is affecting a lot of people, as you say, the 1 million large fires just this year. And the thing is, too, even after this series wraps, which, with the conclusion of this sort of bonus episode, it will, the fire conversation doesn't end there. NASA will continue to do its work. You will continue to do your work. You will continue to go to the Amazon and collect data that is then shared freely with the world. And, I think there's something really remarkable about that. And we have to remember that just because the news spotlight or some kind of media attention isn't on a fire at the moment, it doesn't mean that it's not happening around the world and that people are actively trying to get us to a place where we understand more about it so that we can be more prepared in the future.
I agree. I think this is an ongoing conversation. It's a new normal that has both immediate consequences when a fire is burning in your community and long-term impacts in terms of the way in which those fires are going to be changing ecosystems, changing the communities that live in and around them. And it's important to remember that although the spotlight has shifted this year from extreme fires in California to Australia to Alaska to the Amazon there will be more fires. But when the media spotlight shifts, the fire's not over in those communities. In fact, many of these fires will burn for months. And so the air quality concerns that we focus on initially extend to those communities until the fire is out. And when the fire is out, now the process of both ecosystems recovering as well as those communities recovering has a long lag time. Yeah. And so I think that's another aspect of this that we're starting to appreciate. The fire emergency isn't just on the day when the fire starts. It's kind of a chronic emergency that's now extended over the time frame from recovery from one fire season and preparations to the next one.
But as you say, one thing that I really loved that you know, was just a glimmer of hope was that there was nothing particularly, I think, in terms of records. You know, we had plenty of records for the fire season this year, sure, but it's going to continue to be like that every year. We don't need a record to do something, though. And having that free and open data is crucial to making small steps, engaging the world, getting policy and political action quickly by basically coming together as a community affected by fire, as a world affected by fire. So I think there is some hope to that, just the mobility, the agility in which people can react to these sorts of things. Would you agree with that?
I would. I mean, there's an old quip that you can't solve a problem you can't see. And what we do with satellite data is shed light on the problems as we see them. And so by collecting information that, from our satellites and distributing that information to decision makers on the ground all over the world, we're helping to be one step in the process of solving these problems. So that's really important to me, and it's a job we'll continue to do. And those patterns will continue to play out in ways that I hope will help scientists like me and my colleagues here at the Goddard Space Flight Center contribute to a sustainable solution for fire as we look at it all over the world.
And I think that's the perfect place to end. You know, we've got our people, they're doing the good work. You were part of that, and we could not be more appreciative of that. And so thank you for being with us the entire season, being sort of a North Star for us, helping us understand, you know, complicated themes around fires, global fires, and we love it and appreciate it. So thank you so much, Doug.
Thank you, Lauren.